Patient talk.
Perfect. So can we just get you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Dr. John Breffer. I'm a doctor, author, specialising in well-being and wellness issues.
So what is vitamin D?
So it's often called a nutrient, but actually it's probably more accurately described as a hormone, and it's produced in the skin in response to sunlight. It appears to have a number of different roles in the body, including some protection from what we call chronic or long-term disease, like heart disease and several forms of cancer and multiple sclerosis. It also appears to have an influence on mood. So we know that, for example, vitamin D seems to have a broadly sort of antidepressant effect, and it also appears to be important for immunity, so that higher levels of vitamin D are associated with relative resistance to infections, including cold and flu.
So how do we naturally obtain vitamin D?
Well, we can get a little bit from our diet, but most of our requirements for vitamin D come from sunlight, but only in the UK from about March through to October, and only really in the middle of the day when the sun is actually quite high in the sky. So what that means practically for people is that for the most part, most people in the UK are quite deficient in vitamin D, and realistically then, in order to get sort of sufficient and optimal levels of it, supplementation is probably the only practical way.
So are there any other problems associated with a vitamin D deficiency, and how many of us are actually vitamin D deficient in the UK?
Well, there is some evidence, there was some evidence published about 10 years ago, which showed that through the winter, about 90% of British people would be regarded as vitamin D insufficient. I actually think it's a bit worse than that. It generally gets worse over time as more and more people sort of restrict their exposure to sunlight. But also the levels that we use to determine insufficiency, I think, were set in that study quite low. I'm sorry, what was the first question?
So what are some other problems associated with vitamin D deficiency?
Well, if it gets low enough, it can affect bone. So, for example, in children, they'll be prone to a condition called rickets. In adults, there's going to be an increased risk of what we call osteoporosis. But also in adults, what you find in people, usually with crashingly low levels of vitamin D, is that they start to become very achy. The muscles are tender, and they often have pain that's sort of all over the body, basically. Now, that's quite extreme, but it does happen, and it's particularly a problem in individuals most prone to vitamin D deficiency.
Is there a relationship between vitamin D and multiple sclerosis? And if there is, should they be taking vitamin D supplements?
So yes, there is a link. We know, for example, that rates of multiple sclerosis get higher, basically, the further away you get from the equator. We also know that there's evidence linking higher vitamin D levels in the body with lower risk of multiple sclerosis. Now, multiple sclerosis is essentially an autoimmune condition where the immune system is reacting against what are called the myelin sheaths, so fatty sheaths around the nerves. And we know that one of the effects of vitamin D is to have a sort of anti-inflammatory, anti-autoimmune effect. And it's possibly through that mechanism that vitamin D appears to afford some protection from multiple sclerosis. Should people with multiple sclerosis take vitamin D? Well, we don't have studies, I believe, that have given people with multiple sclerosis vitamin D to see what effect it has. But I would say it would be a sensible thing for individuals with multiple sclerosis to consider. What may help, though, is for them to know whether or not they have an issue around vitamin D. And so testing of vitamin D, I think, is very legitimate, particularly for these people, and then supplement at levels based on whatever the level is found in the blood.
Perfect. And finally, can you just give us the web link just for some more information, please?
So it's Vega vitamins, VEGA vitamins.co.uk.
Perfect. And that's all we need. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you very much, Emily.
Cheers. Have a good one.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.